Ladies and gentlemen, aloha. First of all, I have to commend Rachel and her father, Steve, for what they do. It's not an easy job. You know, they get tomatoes thrown at them oftentimes at annual meetings, and like Rachel said, that book is like that thick. You know, I have a hard time reading my son's little baby books and pronouncing some of those words. You know, I can't imagine reading that thing on a regular basis. Today, I'm going to be speaking about, as you know in your pamphlets there, operating budgets and reserve studies for your associations. So we'll start with the operating budget for your association. As many of you are probably aware, the operating budget is essentially, you know, the estimated revenues and expenses in order to run your association properly. First, we always look at expenses generally in the budgeting process because we need to determine what we need to collect in order to cover those expenses. So what are your expenses generally for an association that you see? The obvious ones are personnel, your employees that you have in your association, your contracted your contracted services, your professionals, your management companies. You have your utilities, your insurance, your repairs and your services, or your repairs and your maintenances, and your reserve contribution. You should be aware, like Rachel said, to review your governing documents in regarding to the operating budget, because oftentimes it will establish some of the basic requirements that you are required to fund for your association. Once you have the expenses determined, you really can then determine what kind of revenues you need to collect or what your maintenance fees should be based on the expenses that your association has. So where do your revenues come from? Obviously, everyone loves it, your monthly maintenance fees or your quarterly maintenance fees, and sometimes annual. Your rental income, sometimes associations will have rental income from a rooftop antenna from cell phone services, or they might have an association-owned unit that they rent out. Electricity reimbursements and water reimbursements. Sometimes associations will be sub-metered for electricity and water. Water is a little bit more difficult, but oftentimes you will see associations that have each unit sub-metered for electricity services, and then charge that back to the homeowner based on their consumption. 514B establishes some minimum requirements that associations need to follow in regards to their budget preparation and the reserve study preparation. First of all, obviously, it should be done on an annual basis. Why is that important? Is because we need to make sure that we are keeping up to date with what the expenditures actually are. Those change on a regular basis. We want to make sure that those are updated accordingly. If you do have an increase in your maintenance fees, statute requires that you provide 30-day notice to the homeowners of any potential increase in maintenance fees. Sometimes your governing documents will put further stipulations on that and require a 60-day notice. So again, make sure you're familiar with your specific governing documents. Some other things that we do need to disclose to the homeowners is the estimated reserves at year end, or essentially your beginning balance for your reserve study. How much money do you anticipate to have in your reserve accounts at year end? And that information is utilized in your reserve study. We need to disclose the reserve contribution that is anticipated for the upcoming year. How much do you set aside and contribute to your reserve fund in order to fund your capital expenditures? It's a zero-based budget process, essentially. We look at essentially it's a nonprofit that we're running, right? So we're not out to make a profit when you're running your association. So we really look at the contracted services. How much are those contracted services? What are the anticipated increases for those contracted services, such as your refuse, your elevator service, your mechanical equipment, maintenance contracts? Those are generally numbers that we know and we can anticipate the increases. Obviously, we do need some historical information in regards to electricity usage, water usage. Generally, we will know what the increase will be for those services prior to creating your budget for the next fiscal year. So make sure that those increases are factored in as well. You have your insurance premiums, you have your management services, you have your refuse services. Again, your governing documents will establish what is required of you. Oftentimes, governing documents will require a managing agent be involved. Governing documents will always have language in there about insurance coverage. We have world-famous Sue Savio here that will help you get the best coverage for the best price. Some recommendations that I have when preparing your operating budgets. Keep personal agendas out of it. Carol touched on fiduciary duty. We need to keep our personal agendas out of it. If you are joining the board to keep maintenance fees down, you should probably relook at the purpose of serving on the board. We need to look out for the best interest of the association. We need to make sure that we are collecting sufficient funds to cover our expenditures and to cover our future capital expenses. Start the process early. Don't wait until October, November, right before your next fiscal year. Start the process early. Do some investigation. Form a budget committee. What does that help with? It gives you an opportunity to review contracts, look at their expiration date. It allows you to go out for bidding and possibly get better pricing on some of those items. So start the process early and form a budget committee. Your budgets oftentimes will always have mandatory spending, generally established by your governing documents, and you have some discretionary spending. Very little, but you do have some discretionary spending in your operating budgets. You have your basic utilities that's required, your insurance, your management, contracted services, your reserve contribution, all mandatory essential expenses that you have for your association. Some discretionary spending that you may have is your personnel. It is ultimately up to the board how much personnel or how many employees you have, whether or not you contract services out rather than having in-house employees. Security contracts, some people, obviously security is an important issue, but ultimately that's a discretionary expense. So if you are trying to curb maintenance fee increases, look at these different items in your discretionary items, your discretionary line items. To be honest, and many of you on the board are aware of this, it is difficult to keep maintenance fees down or minimizing increases in your maintenance fees. There are a few things that you can do to help curb increasing maintenance fees. Like I touched on, make sure you know your contracts. Work with your property manager to know when the termination date of your contracts are. Provide notice to those vendors saying, we are putting you on notice that we're going to switch over to month and we're going to go out to bid, because we want to make sure that we're getting the best pricing for the services that we're contracting. So know your contracts so you can get competitive proposals and maybe save some money in that area. For those that have personnel or contracted services, do a comparison. What's the expense of in-house personnel versus contracted services? Do a comparison and see what is best for your association in regards to the overall service that you're receiving and the overall funds that you're paying out. Sue might touch on this, but obviously there are some risk management decisions that need to be made as well with in-house employees versus contracted services. The board ultimately has discretion with what is budgeted in your operating budget. Be honest, be upfront. If you do know that there is an increase in maintenance, an increase in contracted services or utilities, make sure that those are identified and those are budgeted accordingly. The last thing we want to do is exceed our operating budget by 20% and have to go out to ownership for approval for exceeding the budget by 20%. Spend money to save money. Oftentimes you can spend money in order to save operational expenses. For example, have you updated your light fixtures in your lighting in your association? Do you have LED lighting in your hallways? Do you have fixtures in your staircases that are motion sensors that basically kick down to a certain percentage of power? As soon as that door swings open, then they kick up to 100%. Are you looking at your fixtures, your light fixtures? Also, if you provide hot water in your association, compare gas versus electric. There's incentives for both the gas company and Hawaii Energy. So understand your systems, and if there's a possibility to benefit from any kind of rebate, and utilize newer equipment rather than the old gas hogs. If your elevator system is 30 years old, or your boilers or your heat pump are 20 years old, obviously they're reaching their useful life. The equipment nowadays is much more energy efficient than it was a long time ago. So obviously there will be savings in your electricity consumption and your gas consumption if you update your equipment. The operating budget cannot be completed or finalized until you have completed your reserve study. Why is that? The reserve study basically establishes what your reserve contribution will be for the next fiscal year. Do you need to contribute $300,000 next year or $600,000 next year to your reserve? Again, that's determined by your reserve study. In your operating budget, generally you should have an expense line for a transfer from your operating account to your reserve account on a monthly basis to make sure that your future capital expenditures are budgeted accordingly. So we're going to touch on the reserve study basically a little bit here. We do have a shortage of time. I could talk about this for a very long time, but we do have a shortage of time here, so I will touch on the main topics of a reserve study. Again, it's done every year with your operating budget. It's essentially a roadmap or a long-range planning tool that we utilize in order to make sure that we have our capital expenditures or our capital components funded for future expenses. It's a financial forecast for funds required for your association to collect. Please keep in mind, a reserve study is not a crystal ball. It is estimates. It is going to be based on industry standards in regards to the cost and the useful life. And obviously that will vary from association to association, so it is based on estimates. It's not a forensic inspection when you do a level 2 reserve study. Essentially, all it is, we're doing a visual inspection, determining what's in the association, what has the associations, or what are the association's components that need to be included in the reserve study. So it is not an in-depth forensic inspection. Oftentimes, you need to engage an engineer to really look at your mechanical equipment, a structural engineer to look at your spalling issues. So it is just essentially a visual inspection in order to get budgetary numbers in there for your association's future capital expenditures. There are 3 different levels to a reserve study. A level 1 reserve study, essentially it's oftentimes your first reserve study that you do, basically creating a component list of what's included in that reserve study, getting some pricing of that, establishing the useful lives of those components. Then you have a level 2 reserve study that is performed or should be performed every 2 to 3 years is what I would recommend. A level 2 reserve study essentially is an update of those numbers that were established in addition to performing a site inspection. Walk the property with your property manager or your budget committee, or if you engage a reserve specialist, a third-party consultant. Walk the property with them. Make sure that everything is in your reserve study that should be in your reserve study. A reserve study is a living document. If it's not in there, add it. For example, I managed one association several years ago. We were doing a level 2 reserve study, and the electrical transformers for that association are obviously enclosed in an electrical vault. Oftentimes those are owned by HECO, but for this association, those electrical transformers were actually owned by the association. They were not previously in the reserve study, and it's a substantial cost to replace electrical transformers. So it's a living document. If something's not in your reserve study, add it.